Hey, so good news. This is the last video you guys are going to have to do. Bad news is we need to cover 4 standards. So I'm going to try to make it quick, guys, promise. Hang in there with me. All right, here we go. We are at standard 5.7. This is spatial organization of agriculture. Really all we're talking about in this standard is how economic forces have impacted agricultural practices, and more specifically, how has it impacted agribusiness. And just know when you hear that word agribusiness, that is agriculture that's conducted on commercial practices, especially where you have a lot of high technology being used. Okay, so your notes are divided up into 4 sections, and the first is going to be large scale farms. I wouldn't get caught up in writing all of this. I would make sure that you know the number of farms has decreased while the size of farms has increased, and we talked about this in earlier standards. I wouldn't write all this down, but it is interesting to note that in 1935 there were 6.8 million farms, averaging about 155 acres each in size. But today, look how that's dropped from 6.8 million to 2 million. And look how much bigger they are on average, 444 acres versus 155. So, like when we talk about agribusiness, many farms are run by people that do not even live on the land anymore. So, it's not small scale farming. And that last bullet, you might note that mechanization has made it easier for large plots of land. Um, and the number of farms has been consolidated. Okay. And then the next, you might just draw this, guys, because it's pretty good little graph here. And it just shows agriculture commodity chains and what is all involved. And when we talk about commodity chains, that commodity just means like a product or a good that can be exchanged or traded. And commodity chain is just this series of links connected by multiple places with production and distribution, and it results in a commodity that can be exchanged on a world market. So here you have the big food corporation, right? That's the big umbrella of what we're looking at. And it just shows where it starts, right? You have farm production, then it goes to food processing, then food production factory, and then it goes to like the grocery store, okay? And then below that is all of this has to require transportation. That's why you see that long line. So from farm production all the way to the grocery store, you have to have transportation. And then above that, you're going to have research and developing, and most directly related to the food retail store is going to be marketing, right? Like how it's advertised. So if you need to pause the video and draw that, that'd be a good thing to just put in your notes there. Okay. And then next is going to be how technology has increased the carrying capacity of land. And so again, I wouldn't get too caught up in this. Maybe just make a note that complex machines can cover land more cheaply because we're not using human labor, so you're not having to pay people. And then intensive use of herbicides, pesticides, fertilizers, always note that that's going to increase the crop yield. And then down at the bottom is just transportation. Obviously self-explanatory. When you have transportation advances, that's going to get you crops to the market faster. It's also going to get them there cheaper and in good condition, because now we have refrigerated trucks that can keep products refrigerated. All right, and then the last is going to be labor force. So this is kind of interesting. So because large farms have increased by the machines they're using, we see obviously a lot of human labor and loss of jobs. In a lot of developing countries, guys, it's like women are working in farms. And so you see that female participation is going to decline on a global level. You also see, unfortunately, a lot of family farms go out of business because they can't compete at that corporate level. And then we do see a lot of migrant labor actually get used more because they will work for a lower wage. Okay. So that is going to conclude 5.7, and then we'll move on to 5.8. Hey, hey, 5.8, here we come. All right, what's interesting about this is standard is all about a model, okay, called the Van Thunen model. And here's how your notes are set up. What you're going to do in that first area is draw the model. So I'm going to go through each zone so you can draw it first, and then we'll talk about description and why there. So all you need to know about Van Thunen is he was a German economist farmer, and that he determined and predicted agricultural land use patterns. Okay, so we're going to start with the first inner ring there, and that's going to be called the market. This is also kind of an urban model, your central business district. So all you need to know is the market is where all the goods are being brought to sell to people. Okay, and you can see my pictures there as people at like a farmer market setup. Okay, that's the market. And then that first ring, which is closest to the market, is going to be where all your dairy is, where your fruits and vegetables are. And these are all perishable items that don't have a long shelf life. And they got to be close to the market. If they're not, like this model is before we had refrigerators, right? So you had to have them close to the market so they would sell quickly. And you also had to consider transportation costs. It was going to be expensive to go any further out from that ring. All right. And then the second ring from the market, which you guys might find interesting or question why, is lumber. It was in this outer ring. And the reason that you kept your lumber and grew your trees or forests in this ring is because you had to build structures out of it, right? Your buildings and your homes were built out of the lumber there. And so it was really heavy, and it was going to be really expensive if you had your forest and lumber industry way out, because you had to pay for that transportation to get in. Okay. So I just have a note there, consider costs and transportation during the 1800s. All right, our third ring from the market is going to be where our grains are grown. Okay, so because grains are really not light and not heavy, and they're also not perishable, so you were able to keep the grains pretty far from the market because transportation costs were not going to be very expensive to haul that in. All right, and our last ring, the outermost ring, furthest from the market, is going to be where you have your extensive space where animals are going to thrive on open land. And during the 1800s, animals could be herded or even walk to the market. So you might be thinking, well, they could be heavy and that could be expensive for transportation. But the idea here is in the 1800s, most of these animals were going to be herded into the market. Okay, so those are your rings. Hopefully you got to draw that. Now let's talk about each zone specifically with a quick description and why there. Okay, so remember our market, we need to have it there because that's where everybody comes and sells their products and buy their products. Zone 1, okay, remember that's where you're going to have your dairy, and you're also going to have your fresh fruits and vegetables. And the reason for that is because of it being perishable and needed to be close to the market. Also, that is intensive farming. Guys, these are all examples of intensive farming. Fruits, vegetables, and dairy cattle. That is intensive farming. It takes a lot of work and a lot of labor. And so you didn't want to pay for transportation costs if that was way out beyond zone 4. Okay, then remember zone 3 is your forest. That's going to be your logging industry. And in this time period, that is where you used a lot of forests as your resources for building structures. And then and the reason for it being in zone 2 is you wanted to keep it close to the market because, again, transportation costs, okay, were expensive and logs were heavy. And then zone 3, that's where your grains are. And it was okay to have them kind of out from the market because they're really light in weight and transportation costs were not going to be as expensive. And then zone 4, that is going to be where you have your herds and kind of like your ranching style animals. Okay. And remember again that a lot of those herds could be walked in. Okay. And one thing you might note, you don't have to write it down, is you would do shifting cultivation here, and a lot of times you would shift your pasture animals into zone 3 because they would provide manure, which was a great fertilizer for those grains, and you would shift those zones back and forth. Okay, and then down here, the land cost just shows when we talk about bid rent rule, how land cost in zone 1 was going to be more expensive than your extensive zone. Okay. All right, there's one more thing we need to cover, and that is kind of some problems with this model. So there were some assumptions that Van Thunen made, and here they are really quick here, is that all land was equal, and we know that's not true. All land is flat, we know that's not true, and that there was only going to be one single market, and that is not true, and that transportation costs were based on distance, and sometimes there's going to be situations where that is not always true. So what you're going to do is just quickly in your notes, we're going to kind of talk about the reality and why a lot of those assumptions are not true. So first thing you have is physical landscape, and you just need to make a note that not all land and resources are equally distributed. So not all places are going to have access to water, right? If we look at northern Africa, which is basically a desert, that is not going to be equality of land resources. We also need to consider the impact of where it can be grown because of climates, and that's next. So not all climate zones are going to be temperate, yet we can still get strawberries in the middle of winter, right? And that is because there are multiple markets all over the world with different climate zones. And then that leads us right into multiple markets. When we talk about multiple markets being available on a local level, just think about it this way. You can go to a farmer's market like the one in downtown Fountain, or you can go to Costco, or you can go to Super Walmart, or you can go to King Soopers, right? And so forth. So this is the idea of multiple markets being available on a local level. This was not, thought of in the Van Thunen model, right? He only had one market in his model. And then multiple markets at a regional and global level. Guys, this is really important because you do have difference of markets at different scales. So when we do think about where are we getting our strawberries in the middle of winter, well, they're coming from probably another country, and usually you can read on the label where they're coming from. So regional aspects of food can define a community. If you've ever bought local, right, there's you will see like vendors alongside the road selling cantaloupes. And in Colorado, most of those cantaloupes are coming from Pueblo or Rocky Ford. And if you love sweet peaches, there's usually a very short season in the summer where you can get peaches alongside the road from Palisade, Colorado, which is right on the other side of Grand Junction. Okay, but like those are seasonal things that are regional. So if you think about where you're getting peaches in the middle of winter, it's not going to be in Colorado, right? Okay, and then transportation changes. Just consider how transportation has changed since the 1800s, right? We no longer are using horse and wagon to move these goods, and that was also another assumption that Van Thunen made with his model. And again, this just shows trucks and trains and how they've increased our mobility to go really long distance. I also want to note that containerization is something we'll learn about as well in an upcoming unit. And this was a great invention of being able to move goods. And I'll show you this next picture here. You can see these containers and even in these grain elevators. Guys, this is on a ship, right? So note that we can move goods pretty much anywhere after we have the invention of these containers. And we can get goods to really hard to reach places because of this. Okay, and then last is technology advancements. Why is the market global? Well, because of all these advancements in technology, it's allowed us to keep foods perishable and fresh over time, such as preservatives and even shipping refrigeration. And I think one of your dictionary words is cold chains, which is how we transport goods and being refrigerated. All right, guys, that concludes 5.8. All right, here we go, 5.9. So in this standard, we're going to talk about the big global system of agriculture on a global level and how regions are dependent on each other from the production to the consumption. Okay, so if you are in the A through A through K group, I need you to make a quick adjustment on your notes and change that last bullet point to infrastructure. I don't know, there was a typo there, but I think I fixed this in time for the L through Z group. So that bottom bullet again should be infrastructure. If you would change that really quick, and then we'll go ahead and get rolling on this. For your first bullet point, global supply chain. Again, I wouldn't try to write all of this, but the big takeaway is that globalization has created interdependence between countries, especially when we look at larger countries that have developed agriculture. So larger countries with really developed agricultural areas are going to export food to smaller, lesser developed agricultural countries. And I just listed some of the really big, larger countries that are developed. There's going to be United States, Brazil, China, and Argentina, top food exporters for the world. And then countries, obviously, with climate advantages that are closer to the equator, they're going to grow a lot of those really like luxury crops where rare fruits and even sugar, tea, and bananas are considered luxury crops. And this is common sense, guys, but those southern hemisphere countries usually are going to be the ones that provide food to those northern hemisphere countries, especially during the winter months. And that goes back to the question of, hey, where are you getting your strawberries in the middle of winter? Probably the southern hemisphere. Okay. All right. And the next one on export commodities. So there is two things that I want you to note is the economic and environmental problems in developing countries here. So when you have farmers that are in developing countries growing these luxury crops, they are doing it at the expense of not growing things for their own local communities, okay? And because of that, their food crops are going to have to be imported at a higher price, and we're going to probably see that at the grocery store when we go to pay, right? The other thing I want you to know is more environmental. And so again, those farmers in those developing countries are often using really poor farming practices that can lead to a lot of environmental damage. And one that's mentioned down there is monocropping, one of your dictionary words. That's where you're growing a single crop year after year after year on the same land. So that can lead to not only environmental problems, but also sustainability problems. All right, next is political relationships and trade networks. And so the big takeaway here is when we talked about hashtag unit 4, colonialism and neocolonialism really affects some of the global agricultural systems. So when we have agribusiness based in developed countries like the United States, they are often going to control a lot of the land and crop production in those developing countries. And here we will talk more about trade when you got fair trade when you guys come back from spring break. But these are movements where they are going to make sure that those workers and laborers and farmers in those developing countries are going to get paid the full wage for those products and have equality. And that last bullet there just talks about relationships between former colonies and their mother countries often make trade easier. Okay, and that all goes back to colonialism and neocolonialism. All right, and then the last was based on infrastructure. This is pretty straightforward. When you have poor infrastructure in developing countries, it's just going to make it harder to get food to the market, okay? So farmers in developing countries may not have really good access to roads. And if you guys have ever traveled outside the United States to a developing country such as Mexico, you're going to notice that right away, that they have a lack of infrastructure. It's not as advanced as it is in the United States. And so most of these transportation routes connect farmers to ports or exports. And then also farmers in these developed countries, they can actually ship their food products more cheaply across the the world because they have an advantage because we have a strong infrastructure in these developed countries. So crops from developed countries are often more plentiful and cheaper to buy than those from developing countries. All right, guys, that concludes 5.9. We are at the last standard we are going to cover in remote. Okay, guys, hang in there. We're almost done. So 5.10 is going to be consequences of all of these agricultural practices. And the way your notes are set up is all of these listed are going to be consequences, right? However, these first three are going to be environmental consequences, and these last five ideas are going to be consequences on the landscape. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with the environmental consequences. And so the first thing we're going to talk about is desertification. And so we're going to look quickly at Africa, and you can see that Africa has many deserts, both in North Africa and the Sub-Saharan Africa. And these areas where these deserts are actually growing. You can see the original size in red and how they are branching out in those orange areas. So what are the implications of this? It's difficult to use this area when it's just that dry. And there are consequences when you're trying to irrigate dry land like this and grow food. Okay, so the problem is as this starts to spread and encroach on even urban communities, we have a lot of risks, guys, especially in these areas that have huge populations. So I circled this area on the map of India and Southwest Asia, where there are literally billions of people that have to be fed. Okay, so this map is showing the risk of human-induced desertification. Okay, and we look again at Africa. And why is desertification happening? Guys, much of it is due to human activity. Pastoral nomadism is one of your dictionary words, where animals are overgrazing. And we also have a loss of vegetation and where they're losing their roots, and the wind picks up and expands these areas. Okay, so that is desertification. And here's just a quick example where you can see it actually encroaching on a city. So this is just not sustainable at all. That's why it's a very negative consequence. Next is going to be pollution, and this can be tied back to not only fertilizers, but also animal waste. So chemicals such as fertilizers are airborne, and that can result in air pollution. But we also see animal waste, especially coming in the United States from North Carolina, where all the hog farms are. This is a huge contributor. Manure ends up in our soil, and it even ends up in our water. So these are pink cesspools of animal waste, guys, and they will use these to irrigate land around it. And there's a lot of, health consequences for people that live around these areas. Okay, let's look at these feedlots that we saw in the Food Machine documentary, right? This is where cattle are being fattened up right before slaughter with corn. And so we call these CAFOs. And they are also another huge contributor to pollution. And there's still no real answer to dispose of all the animal waste that is being collected. All right, let's look at soil salinization. This is basically just when you have too much salt in the soil. And a quick little case study that you can include in your notes is this happened in Egypt when a dam was built. So there was some really good things that came out of the dam, but there was also some damaging consequences because it was built in a very dense area of population. There was flooding issues, and the consequence to this was that because of the dam, you're disrupting the flow of river, and it stopped the washing away of salt in the soil. And so when you have that happen, it's almost impossible to farm there. And so now this area in Egypt has to rely on chemicals to remove salt from their soil. Okay, so that was environmental consequences. Let's look at landscape consequences. So we're going to come back to slash and burn because that's going to be kind of part of deforestation at the bottom. So we'll come back to that. Let's talk about terrace farming. You have probably seen pictures of this. It's absolutely breathtaking. And this is usually a practice of farming done in Southeast Asia where it's a very mountainous or hilly. And this is how they grow crops. And so you can see that they are setting up almost stair steps so that they will collect and store water to be as it's almost like a foolproof irrigation system there. But you're probably thinking, how is this a consequence? Well, it's changing the landscape. That's what you have to remember. So therefore, this type of farming does have a consequence on the landscape. All right, next is irrigation. And you've seen lots of pictures the past couple of weeks of these pivotal irrigation sprinklers. And you've probably seen these if you've been on road trips. But because they're pivotal, they're going to leave a circle, right? Circles, if you've ever been on a plane, you've seen these patterns. And it is also changing the landscape across our rural land. So the irrigation in the system is showing as a byproduct of circles seen on farms. All right, also irrigation system, you can include ditches and trenches. It's just another example of changing landscape. We're redirecting water where it's needed. Again, a consequence of changing landscape. And here's a quick study on the aerial sea. It shrunk by 60% in 50 years because the water was being pulled from the rivers that feed the aerial sea. And you have to think about what else is being impacted when something like this happens. Because of the shrinking of the aerial sea, you have other industries that are lost, like the fishing industry. Okay, and then the draining wetlands. I'm not sure if you guys know what a polder is, but these are very common in the Netherlands. And so some areas that are too wet, they will drain these areas. And this is actually an example of a photo of a polder in the Netherlands. And it's just a really low-lying piece of land that's reclaimed from a sea or even a river. And it's usually protected by dikes, especially you see a lot of these in the Netherlands, right? And so these are just areas that are wet that now look very dry, and they've just maximized the land. All right, and then deforestation, and this, you guys have heard of deforestation. It's very devastating because of what it's doing to our rainforest. So that's basically what it is the clearing of trees, and we see this most common in South America, in the Amazon rainforest and many parts of Southeast Asia. So it is a systematic clearing of land, specifically again in the Amazon, where it's being cleared for logging and a lot of ranching, growing cattle. So most of that is going to be at a commercial level. Okay, this is just a really quick pie chart that shows you most of the Amazon is being cleared due to cattle ranching. Now, another system of rainforest loss is going to be, now you can go back to your slash and burn. This is going to be on a subsistence level, not commercial, but slash and burn is where you do have small groups go in and they are literally cutting and clearing and burning and then moving on to another area of land. And this obviously is also going to leave a visual imprint on our rainforests. We see a lot of deforestation in Malaysia to the palm oil industry. And so many of our products at the food have palm oil. So this becomes a huge concern of demand, supply and demand, and the impact that it is having on our rainforests. All right, guys, that is it. I hope you enjoy your spring break. If you are watching this beforehand, or I hope you had a great spring break if you're watching this at the tail end. And we will see you all back in person on Monday. Bye.